So let me ask you, have you ever wanted to fire a client, but maybe just didn't quite know how to go about doing this? Have you ever maybe thought that you don't have a choice in who your clients are? I actually once had a real estate agent tell me that we don't get to choose our clients, and I very politely told her that I beg to differ. We do actually, in fact, have the right to choose whom we want to work with and whom we don't. Now, that doesn't mean that you want to go around firing all of your clients necessarily, but you want to keep in mind that you deserve to be paid your worth. So, for starters, before even getting to the point of firing a client, you might want to consider which clients you want to say no to. So I always talk a great deal about finding your ideal client, and if you know who your ideal client is, then it's probably stands to reason that you know exactly who your ideal client isn't. So if you see some red flags coming up, understand that you do have the right to refuse to service this client. So some of those examples might be someone who right off the bat is asking for a discounted price, or is telling you that every other stager is offering the world to them, but they really want to use you, so your price needs to come down in order for them to be able to use you. Maybe they've asked you to make an exception to one of your policies. Maybe they've returned your contract to you all marked up with all sorts of amendments that they're asking for. Maybe they've asked you to make just this one exception on payment terms. Whatever the case may be, these are some red flags that come up sometimes with clients, and it's something that you want to be aware of as a home stager, as any business professional. You want to ensure that you are adhering to your policies and your procedures. So first of all, make sure you have some solid policies and procedures in place so that you can easily fall back on your processes when you're explaining to a client what your expectations are and how you work. Always be sure in your very first conversations with your client to set the expectations. What is expected from them, and what can they expect you to provide them with in return? If you notice any friction or any conflict in terms of what they're expecting versus what you're able to offer for maybe what their budget is, then keep that in mind. That could be potentially a red flag. You may wish to walk away. Now, I got to tell you, hindsight's 2020. It's easy to know you should have walked away from a job after the fact, and it's sometimes hard to look into the future, look into your crystal ball, and know whether or not a client is actually going to be a pain in the butt, or if they just kind of seem like they've got some specific things that they've got in mind, but maybe they're going to be a fantastic client in the end. But usually if you see a red flag, pay attention to it, listen to your gut. Now, when it comes to firing a client, that is a whole other story. So again, it's important to have your policies and your procedures in place, because you have to understand what firing them as a client means to you and your business. And if you've taken any payment from them for an upcoming project, what does it mean to that? Generally, the best way to get rid of a client is to give them their money back, send them on their way, and tell them to go and deal with someone else. One thing that I know that a lot of business professionals do, not just home stagers, but they build in what's called a Pita Chart if needed, which is basically considered, stands for PITA, stands for pain in the butt. But you can substitute that with, throw in the proper adjective there. In any case, you are welcome to build in that charge, but I often find that no matter how much of a Pita charge you build into a price, I still don't feel as though it's worth the stress, and I've been guilty of it. Even when I've said, I know that someone's not my client, but I've been convinced to take them on as my client, and they always end up turning out to be an absolute disaster. So I have learned to listen to my gut and know when to take on a client and when to say no to them. But like I said, once that client has hired you, maybe they've just hired you for the consultation, and now they want to hire you for additional services, but you're not comfortable going ahead with the additional services. It might be something where you might want to consider giving them their consultation fee back in order to send them on their way. Keep in mind, whatever you're giving them, it's not to say that you're giving them a free consultation because there wasn't value there, but if they now need to hire another home stager to do a consultation because you're not willing to work with them, you have to see it from their point of view, right? So the best way for you and your company to come out on top in all of this is to ensure that you are accommodating them and their needs still. So perhaps it's as simple as having a conversation with them and explain that you don't think that you're a good fit with them, and if you've taken any sort of deposit from them for a project, maybe returning that. Ultimately, though, you hope that it doesn't even get to that point. And that's why I say it's important to know when to say no to a client. It's way more important to know when to say no than to fire a client, because once you're firing a client, you need to make sure that you're protected. So in your contract, you need to have a termination clause. And in that termination clause, you need to be able to state specifically what the terms would be should there be any termination. Now, keep in mind, part of that termination clause, can be that if they're in default of contract. So if they've done anything from start to finish at this point where they have breached the contract essentially, then they're in default of that contract, in which case you do have the authority to invoke that clause and get out of the contract. And then you also want to make sure that in that contract it's clearly outlined what sort of payment terms come up if the contract is terminated. So for example, if you haven't done any work on the project, you give them a refund in full, but if you've done work, then that's got to be deducted. Or if it's 3 days before the staging date, then you're going to keep the entire amount and they owe you for the full balance, or whatever the case may be. I'm not saying that this is what your term should be. I'm saying that make sure that it is clearly stated based on the amount of notice they give you, based on the reasons for termination, what exactly you need to get out of that. And then be very careful and make sure that your lawyers are involved when it comes to getting out of a project, especially if you've already taken money. The alternative is, of course, you give them all their money back, you walk away clean and free, and you don't really have to worry nearly as much about the legal implications of it. So have a conversation with the client before officially firing them, and have a conversation to explain to them again what your expectations are. And what I like to try to do when it comes to firing a client is get it to be their decision. So there are ways to work them around to that aspect of the conversation, and maybe saying like, oh, that's really not how I do things. If that's the stage that you're looking for, that's really not me. I don't know how I can help you with this. Unfortunately, this is how we do things. And once you've said no to a few of their demands, it might be better to gear them towards maybe another stager would be in your best interest. Oh, you already spoke to another stager. You know what? I'd hate to lose you as a client, but maybe that's the best way for you to go. Right? Or, maybe just say to them, listen, it's nothing personal. I really get along with you really well. I like you, but I think that the style and the expectations that you have just doesn't fit with my company. And it's not something that I'm able to offer you. So, I appreciate your business. However, I'm going to have to pass at this time. You want to do it as respectfully as possible, because keep in mind, this is your company, your brand, your name essentially attached to all of this in the end. So you want to make sure that you're all on the same page at the end of the day. Anyway, hope that helps you. So remember, the best thing to do is to say no to a client from the beginning. But if you do end up saying yes to them, you want to be very careful and make sure that you are covered through your contract in order to terminate that and get rid of them. And stick to your guns too. I think that's the most critical thing. Once you make the decision that you're not going to work with them, stick to your guns on it and make sure that you fully enforce that and that everyone on your team is fully on board and aware of what you're doing. All right, good luck.